Today, society is more racially tolerant and accepting than it has ever been before, with pioneers such as author Marlon James, rap god Drake, directors Spike Lee and John Singleton, and Tony Award winner Leslie Odom Jr. Black people have made their voices heard throughout the arts, shaping future generations of creators. None of this would have been possible without the opera Porgy and Bess breaking the barrier of how African Americans were viewed in society. Prior to the opera, African Americans were burdened with harmful stereotypes in entertainment, and it was hard for them to be taken seriously. Racism in the entertainment business gained prominence all the way back in the early 19th century with minstrel shows. Minstrel shows were usually white men wearing blackface doing comedic skits, acting in a stereotypical persona. Although minstrel shows were very racist, they made possible the first large-scale entrance into American show business for blacks as they broke the barriers they had faced before. However, in minstrel shows, black people were always the punchline, and they built stereotypes that would plague African Americans for years. While they finally had jobs in entertainment, they were not dignified nor reputable. However, some didn't see black people as a punchline, but instead a people with rich culture that needed to be explored. George Gershwin was a renowned American composer known for his works Rhapsody in Blue, I Got Rhythm, and An American in Paris. However, he most notably produced and composed for the great American opera, Porgy and Bess. Gershwin was born to a poor Russian immigrant family on September 26, 1898, in Brooklyn, New York. George always had a love for music and started writing his own songs at a young age. He frequently collaborated with his brother, Ira, on many songs such as Fascinating Rhythm and The Man I Love. While at this point George was a successful songwriter for musicals, he wasn't considered a serious composer. It wasn't until after writing Rhapsody in Blue in 1924 that he became known as one of America's best composers. Soon after, he felt a calling to write a jazz opera, but he thought the home life American school of drama too drab and dull for something so potentially rhythmic and lyrical. Gershwin stated in a letter of his opera ideas that,
I think it should be a Negro opera. Negro, because it is not incongruous for a Negro to live jazz. It would not be absurd on the stage. The mood would change from ecstasy to lyricism plausibly, because the Negro has so much of both in his nature. I would like to see it put on with a Negro cast. Artists trained in the old tradition could not sing such music, but Negro singers could. It would be a sensation as well as an innovation.
1 year later, Gershwin finished reading the novel Porgy by DuBose Hayward and decided to send him a letter offering to collaborate on a musical adaptation of the book. Porgy was written in 1925 and based in Charleston on the life of Samuel Smalls, who was a cripple and beggar. Samuel was known around town as Goat Cart Sam, as his main mode of transportation was a goat-pulled wagon. Hayward learned of Smalls after reading about an attempted shooting in the paper. Apparently, after his failed shooting, Sam and his goat led a police chase down several roads. Sadly, Samuel Smalls died a year before Hayward's novel Porgy was released. Hayward's Porgy tells the love story of Porgy and Bess and the turmoil that ensues after Bess's former lover, Crown, sneaks into Porgy's room and attempts to abduct Bess and is subsequently murdered by Porgy. The most praised and controversial aspect of the book was how it portrayed the life of African Americans living in Charleston at the time. The portrayal strayed away from the stereotypes depicted in minstrel shows, but retained that life in America for blacks was much different than for whites. During the time of the Great Depression, the majority of African Americans were either unemployed or working unskilled, low-paying jobs. After the stock market crash in 1929, most of the jobs usually taken by black people were either eliminated or filled by previously unemployed whites. Furthermore, they faced Jim Crow laws which enforced segregation. Black schools and facilities were greatly underfunded. Also, the judicial system was greatly biased against black people, which is why many had to take justice into their own hands, like Porgy. When Gershwin and Hayward began to adapt Porgy into an opera, they had trouble deciding the cast. Al Jolson, one of the most famous white minstrels, offered to play the starring role. Jolson is most remembered for starring in the first talking picture, The Jazz Singer.
The sun shines east and the sun shines west, but I know where the sun shines best. Mammy, Mammy.
Gershwin and Hayward debated whether to allow him to play Porgy. He would bring much attention to the opera, but Gershwin wrote, "I really don't know how he would be in it." George thought the role was much more serious than Jolson could ever do. They eventually decided on an all-black cast. After many years of composition and rewrites, the opera was ready for release in 1935. Retitled Porgy and Bess, the opera premiered on Broadway. At first, it received mixed reactions. This was one of the first times African Americans in entertainment were considered high art, so it was unusual for opera-goers, as most of them were rich and white. Some thought Porgy and Bess was an out-of-touch representation of the lives of African Americans because it was written by white men, but it cannot be refuted that the respect shown for blacks and their culture in the opera was groundbreaking for its time. The black cast was no longer a novelty or comedic pantomime, but instead characters with depth and culture. The jazz and folk music of Porgy and Bess highlighted and shared a facet of black culture that many whites had not yet experienced. Although it has been argued that the somewhat inauthentic representation of African American life hurt race relations, it ain't necessarily so. The central idea portrayed in Porgy and Bess was the shared humanity of whites and blacks. There wasn't as much of an emphasis on accuracy as there was on the message that black people lived real lives as well. It broke the barrier that they were more than the stereotypes caused by minstrel shows. If it were not for Gershwin and his passion to put a proper spotlight on the lives of African Americans, our world would not have some of the theater treasures we are accustomed to today. Porgy and Bess opened the door for black composers, singers, and actors to shine. With hits such as The Wiz, Hamilton, and even readaptations of Porgy and Bess, black actors are in the center of show business. It's been said that Porgy and Bess has never had a definitive score, because just as the relationship between blacks and whites is still evolving, so must the show. Porgy and Bess broke the stereotypes that had haunted Africans for decades. Of course, there is still discrimination just as there is in the rest of the world, but the progress that has been made goes far outside the walls of the theater. Allowing African Americans to show the beauty of their culture through the arts has transformed them from punchlines to real people with a story to tell.